Hi, and welcome to my C# WebDriver video series. In this video, we're going to basically carry on from our last video where we set up a framework. And today we're going to look at a little bit more about the basics of writing a WebDriver script and getting it to a state where we are able to interact with a web page. We're going to look at how to navigate to a particular site. We're going to look at how to interact once we've navigated to a site. And we're also going to take a quick look at how to close a web page after we've done whatever it is that we're trying to do. So if I just quickly recall on what we've already done. So in the last video, all I said was to quickly write these lines of code and didn't really explain what was happening, not in a more sensible amount of detail. So let's do that first. So first of all, the driver class in C# is called the WebDriver class. And on this line, what we're essentially doing is we are creating an instance of the WebDriver class, and we're giving it the name driver. We are then saying that the instance of this driver is equal to a new Firefox driver. So what we're basically saying on this line is, I want to create a new instance of the driver class, and I want to instantiate it as a Firefox driver. Now, if you say want to use a different version, or to be more specific, if you want to use a different type of browser, for instance, Chrome, IE, HTML unit driver, this is where you would define it. So this is essentially where you would go ahead and change the type of browser you want to use. Now, the reason I picked Firefox is because by default, when you try and use Firefox, it just works right off the bat. What it basically does is it just uses your local installation of Firefox. If you use something like Chrome, then you need to download an additional Chrome driver exe and then provide the path to that. So using something like Firefox is usually a quicker solution to get something up and running. So if you need to, say, use other types of browsers, or you want to run in something like a headless browser, for instance HTML unit, or you can go as far as using something like Phantom.js, this is effectively where you define it. But depending on the type of browser you want to use, you may also need to define other, say, browser options or browser properties, such as the path to the browser. Covering other types of browsers is something we could potentially look at for a future video. So moving on, once I've declared an instance of an WebDriver class and given it a name, I can then invoke methods on the driver. So if I just quickly show you, if I type in driver and then I use the dot operator, it gives me a list of options, or rather a list of methods that I can call on this driver. And these methods are basically the API. These are effectively the interfaces I can use as part of the methods which can be found in the WebDriver class. So what I've basically done here is said driver dot navigate, and then I use the dot operator on navigate, which gave me the go-to URL, and this takes in a parameter of type string, and in which case is expecting a URL. So if I were to retype this out, if I say driver dot, and then if I use something like navigate, and then I use the dot on that, it gives me more options. So in this case, it allows me to go to a specific URL if I were to say use URL, but it also allows me to do other things, such as going forward, or rather simulating someone clicking forward button, or simulating someone pushing the refresh button. So once we did that, we then used another method called the quit method. So there is a difference between driver quit and another method called driver close. Now, I used the driver quit method to quit the instance of the driver. But there is a slight confusion between the two, and let me explain what the confusion is. A lot of people use driver.quit and driver.close interchangeably. They basically don't necessarily mix the two up, but they usually are trying to go for one and they end up going for the other, and certain things don't end up working. The difference between the two should be self-explanatory, but I'll explain it on the off chance anyway. What driver.close does, it closes your current open browser, but it keeps the instance of your driver still active. So if you want, you can do another driver.navigate if you want to, albeit your browser will be closed and you'll possibly end up with a null pointer, but the point is your instance of the driver is still open and valid. If you have use something like driver.quit, then what that does is that ends up destroying your instance of the driver, or to put it in a more code level way, it pretty much nullifies your instance. It makes it equal to null. So it makes your instance of driver to null. So this is a little bit more efficient in what I'm trying to do, because once I've done everything I need to do, then I just end up quitting the driver altogether, because there's no reason to keep this resource open anymore. So that's why for this instance, quit is probably a better fit. So before we actually dive into a little bit more about how to interact with the browser once we've opened. So for the moment, all we've looked at is how to open a web browser, and in this instance, a very specific web browser. We've looked at how to navigate to a very specific URL, and we've looked at how to quit the driver once we're done. What we're effectively missing at the moment is steps to interact with the browser. So before we actually look at steps to interact with the browser, let's actually manually look at these steps. So doing that will give us a little bit more understanding in what we're trying to do before we actually go ahead and do it. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to navigate to my Java test site. And this is just a really basic test site that I made. It doesn't do anything kind of glamorous or anything like that. It's just got a few links, it's got some web pages and some web forms, and does some validation and some JavaScript stuff. So the journey we're going to try and simulate is first of all navigating to this site, and then clicking on the contact link. And then once we're on the contact link, I will go ahead and populate one of these fields. I'll probably take this field here. And once I've done that, I'm possibly going to populate another field, and we'll leave it at that. So from an interaction basis, it's actually quite simple. There's really three things we're going to do. We're going to click on contact, populate one of the input fields, and then populate another input field, and that be it. So before we do that, let's just run this just to make sure this still works. So to run it, I can just hit the start button, because this is a main method. Okay, obviously nothing too fancy. I wasn't expecting this to fail. On the note, when I said this is a main method, what should happen is a test should actually sit inside a test method. I won't touch on it too much, but the biggest reason why you would want to keep WebDriver code inside something like a test method is that if it fails, then it's got an elegant way of failing, as opposed to a main method failing, in which case your entire application blows up. And that's the last thing you want a test to do. You want your test to not kind of blow up, but kind of gracefully die and tell you something isn't working. You don't want your application to blow up instead. So the first step we said is we want to be able to click on this contact link. So this poses a question: how do we do that? How do we get to a stage where we can click on a contact link? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to type in driver, and we're going to use the dot operator and see what kind of options we have available to us. Now if you have a look, I'm just going to really quickly glance over a few, but we have stuff like close, dispose, equals, stuff like manage, navigate. These are the kind of things we can spend a little bit more time on in future videos. For the moment, we want a very common method, and it's called the find element method. So what does this method do? What does find element do? So to understand this, we need to look at a web page and understand a little bit more about an element. So on a web page, you have Well, you have your web page. But if you were to look at this web page from an abstract point of view, you actually have many things on this page. You have text which form paragraphs. You have many types of interactable components on a page, like input boxes and radio buttons and checkboxes. You have stuff like sliders, you have stuff like links, you have stuff like tables, you have cells in tables, and so on. I'm sure you kind of get the idea now. All of these things, either collectively or individually, can be represented as an element on the page. So if you want, you can say this entire table is an element. If you want, you can say the button is an element. If you want, you can say this alert is an element. Everything on this page can be represented as an element. So now if we go back and look at our code, when we say driver.findElement, that should almost have obvious meaning now. This should almost instantly tell us that this method is effectively trying to find an element. And that is literally what we're trying to do. We're trying to find an element on a page. So taking a little look at this now, how does this find element work? So to find an element, we need to pass in what's called an identifier. And the identifier is identified by the by class. So if we say by, then dot. This by class now takes in various identifiable identifiers, really. So in this instance, with the by class, we can use something like class name, we can use something like CSS selector, we can use ID, link text, partial link text, tag name, and so on. There are a lot of things to play around with. So again, how does this relate to what's on the page? So if we take an example of one, if we take something like, let's just say ID. If we now have a look at our code, so any web page, if you right click on a web page, you should be able to see something like view page source. Some browsers are a little bit more clever. If you click on an actual element, for instance, this link, it allows you to inspect an element. So before we inspect an element, if I just right click and view page source, it gives me the option to view the page source. The page source is quite literally the backbone HTML of that page. If I have a right click on an element and say inspect element instead, it's just a shortcut to that page source for that element. So here I can say that this element is inside an anchor tag and it has various attributes. Specifically, it's got an ID attribute which has a value of contact underscore link. It's got a href attribute with a value of contact.html, and it's got a name attribute with a value of nav underscore contact. So if we go back and we were to look at these by classes, what they're actually doing is, for the most part, looking for an attribute. So if we set something like by ID, and then this also takes in a parameter, and it takes a parameter of string. In here, if we were to say pass in the ID value of an attribute, so in this case, we want to click on the contact link, and by fortune, it has an ID attribute, which has a value of contact underscore link. If we just copy that and paste that in here, what this method is now effectively saying is find an element which has an ID attribute where the value of the ID attribute is contact underscore link. So what this method now does is effectively helps us find an element on a page with an ID attribute of contact underscore link. Now, why did I use ID? Well, traditionally IDs are usually unique. This ID attribute, assuming that the page when it was written, there was some sensible practicing or code practice standards followed. IDs are usually unique. So another way to think about it is this ID attribute won't exist anywhere else. If we took something like, I don't know, class, where class is a really good example of where the value of class could be used in multiple different places for various around styling and various other things. ID is one of the few attributes which is by definition unique. So if we say something like by ID, this value here should really only be referring to a single element on that page. So now we have means of finding an element, which is good. This now helps us to bridge the gap of how do I find an element on a page. The next challenge is to actually do something to the element. So if we were to say put a dot operator at the end of that method, so find element, where this is effectively the opening brace of the method and this is the closing brace of the method. If we use the dot operator here, we can now see that we have more actions. To be specific, we've got more interactable actions. So in this case, we have something like clear, we have click, we have send keys, submit. We've got actions now, or rather we've got methods now that clearly map as actions. So in this instance, because this is a link, traditionally what we'd like to do is be able to click on it. So if we go back and we select click, what this will now do is basically use the instance of the driver, use the find element method to find an element which has an ID attribute, where the value of the ID attribute is contact underscore link, and then click on that element. So this is now effectively going to click on the contact link. So assuming that's worked, the next thing we said we want to do is to be able to populate one of these fields with some data. So let's just pick this field here, the enter name. So before we even look at the code, we now know that we can use this method called this find element method, and it has the ability to read the attributes of a HTML tag. So if we right click on this and just inspect this, we can see that this also has, luckily for us, some information we can use. It has, well, it is a tag of type input. It has two attributes, where one attribute is type text. One attribute is of type and it's got a value of text, and the other one is name with a value of name underscore field. So unluckily this doesn't have an ID. If it had an ID, then that would have meant to us that this would have been a lot more easier to interact with, but this doesn't, which means that this value here, these attributes here, i.e. type and name, could be used somewhere else. So if we decide to go ahead with type or name, then there is a good chance that it might have been used somewhere else, and when we try and write the code for it, it could end up clicking or interacting with something else. So we're going to have to work with what we have. So in this case, we know that it is of type input and has a couple of attributes. If we look at the source code, however, we can see that based on the hierarchy here, we can see that it is actually using an input tag. And if we just kind of open up all of these fields, the one thing we can see is that although it doesn't really have any uniquely identifying features on that particular row, it is still a little bit unique in that it is effectively the first one to use an input tag. So by definition, when we have this find element method use, even if there is by chance more than one element which shares what we're trying to look for. So let's just say there was something else that had an ID with contact underscore link. This will basically interact with the first one that it finds. So fortunately for us, even though this is of type input, HTML text, it is the first one on the page. So that means we can actually go ahead and use it. So we can say something like driver find element by, and this time we can use what's called a tag name identifier. And in here we can say it's of type input. So the interactable action we want to enforce on this particular field is, in this case, we want to type something in like test, for instance. I can use something like the send keys method on this. Now, what does this method do? The send key method literally sends whatever you pass in as a string to whatever is trying to pass in as a string. So for instance, if I did something like that, it will basically send absolutely no characters to this input field. What I'm basically trying to do is invoke this method on this element that I find. Now, something to note here is there's nothing wrong with me doing something like this. Some of you might have expected this to basically throw an error saying, hold on, you can't write something on a link, and that's entirely true. But what you've got to understand is we're actually chaining two different types of action here. What we're saying is, for the first half, I want you to find something, and for the second half, I want you to do something. So the doing something doesn't necessarily have to make logical sense with the find something. So with that in mind, what does it mean? Well, what this method actually does is quite literally types in keys or sends key characters, keystrokes to whatever you find. So how do we send keys here? That wouldn't have thrown an error, because all that would have literally happened was it would have found this link and then tried to basically push buttons on a keyboard, if you like, from a metaphoric perspective. That wouldn't do anything. But in this line, that makes sense. Once it's found an element, in this case it's an input field, it actually will be able to type something in. So if we said something like, I will subscribe to this channel, for instance, it will go ahead and it will type this in. So the final thing we said is we'll try basically interacting with another input field. So again, let's right click on this and do an inspect element on this. So here we can see again, it's very similar to the first one. So we know we can't use the input anymore, that's out of the question. Why is it out of the question? Because we know that when we try and use something like driver.findElement, it will interact with the first one that it is able to match this criteria against. So if we went with input field, it won't work because it will most likely pick this one again. So we don't want to do that. We need to effectively use something else. So in this instance, we're actually forced to use something else. And the one thing we can use is name. So one thing I tend to do is when I come across something like a name attribute, I do a quick search to see if this address underscore field appears anywhere else. I guess since there's only two attributes, we can use this name attribute. Now, why can we use this name attribute? Well, if you go back and if we start typing in driver.findElement, and again we're going to use the by class, we can see that name is actually an available option to use. Name is a identifier that matches to one of our attribute names. So we can go ahead and use name. So in name, and yes, you've guessed it, all we need to do is pass in the value that appears in name. In this case, it was address underscore field. Close that off. And then we can interact with that as again. So in this case, we'll end up using send keys again. And let's type in a message saying something like, please like this video. So what will happen now is, once it's found this particular element by name, it will try and type this into it. So, like I've discussed, we're going to quit the driver at the end. For the moment, let's not do that. Let's comment that out, so we can see if it's definitely done these three actions. So all I'm going to do is hit the start button to run this code. All right, fantastic. So we can see that it did click on the contact link, and it then did type in, I will subscribe to this channel, and then it was able to find the address input field, and it was able to type in, please like this video. So in this video, what have we covered? Well, the intention of this video was to cover some really basic stuff about using WebDriver's API in C#. We learned how to create an instance of the driver, and we also touched on how to create different types of browsers, or rather how to run your code in different types of browsers. We also looked at how to navigate to specific URLs. We also looked at a handful of methods in terms of identifying an element and then being able to interact with the element. Lastly, we also quit the driver just to make sure everything closed after we were done with it. So although this might seem like a lot of basic information, it is upon this information that you build up complex understanding later on. So there is actually a lot to take from this video. Anyway, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Until next time, ciao. Hi guys, I really appreciate you watching my videos. And if you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you already haven't, hit the subscribe button below. Also, follow me on Twitter, Facebook and Google. Links in the description below. Until next time, ciao.